I used to dream that growing old would be filled with visits from my son, grandchildren's laughter, and the warmth of family holidays. But reality turned out quite different. My son, Jason, spent years finding 1,000 excuses not to visit. Not for Christmas, not for Mother's Day, not even just because. I sat alone in a big house he assumed would one day be his inheritance. Until the day I made a decision. The inheritance would go to those who remembered I was still alive. And that day didn't mark a new beginning for him. It marked one for me. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Brooks. I was 69 years old when I realized silence could be louder than words. I lived alone in a 2-story colonial house on the edge of Bloomington, Indiana. It was the same house where I'd raised my only son, the same place my husband and I had poured decades of our lives into. After he passed, I stayed, not out of fear or lack of options, but because I believed, deep down, that this house still had something left to give, or rather, that someone I loved would come back to it. The house didn't feel empty, not exactly. It had a heartbeat, a rhythm shaped by routine, the creak of the floorboard outside the laundry room, the soft whistle of the kettle I still used every morning, the tap of the grandfather clock we bought in 1983. I kept everything just as it had always been. The front hall mirror still reflected the small chip on its edge. The dining room still held the large mahogany table with 6 chairs, though only one was ever used. I had spent most of my adult life as an elementary school teacher, teaching 4th grade, molding young minds with patience and worn-out books. When I retired, I imagined that time would be filled with visits from my son Jason and, perhaps someday, grandchildren running through the same hallway he once turned into a racetrack for his toy fire trucks. But time is a strange thing. It stretches when you're young and collapses when you get older. It begins to fill itself not with laughter and guests, but with the hum of the refrigerator and the thud of junk mail hitting the floor. Jason had moved to Chicago after college. He said it was for the opportunities, the energy, the career growth. I never argued. I wanted him to fly. I told him to go, to build his life. But I also thought he'd come back, not to stay maybe, but to visit, to remember. At first, he did. Holidays, a few weekends here and there. Then the visits turned into calls. Then the calls became texts. And then, silence. Not sudden, gradual, like dusk creeping in before you realize the sun is gone. I told myself he was busy. Important people lived important lives. He was married now, working in finance, managing big portfolios, or something that always sounded just out of reach. His wife, Elena, was polite the few times we met, though never warm. She once said they might buy a lake house in Michigan. That's when I knew they weren't coming back. Still, I kept the house ready. Every spring I changed out the curtains. I had the guest room sheets washed and folded even if no one slept in them. I kept his favorite books on the shelf in the same order, as if he might come back and notice if one was missing. I cooked too much food on holidays and froze the leftovers. I bought 2 bottles of wine, not one. I lit both candles on the mantel. On Sundays, I sat on the front porch with a mug of tea and watched the street. Sometimes I imagined Jason's car pulling into the driveway. I would picture the passenger door swinging open, his voice calling, "Hey, Mom!" I even rehearsed what I might say, how casual or surprised I should sound, whether to offer food or let him ask first. But the car never came. The driveway remained just a stretch of quiet concrete, broken only by the leaves I swept every Thursday afternoon. There's a certain weight to waiting that people don't talk about. It doesn't feel like drama. It feels like a slow erosion. You begin to second guess whether you're being too sentimental. You wonder if you somehow failed. I read his childhood letters sometimes, Mother's Day cards with misspelled words and scribbled hearts. I kept them in a shoebox in the upstairs closet, next to George's old fishing hat and the blanket we brought home from the hospital the day Jason was born. I never told anyone how much I waited. People would say I was independent, strong, that I didn't need anyone. But they didn't see the third place set at Thanksgiving, the birthday card I bought for him every year and never mailed. They didn't hear the radio turned low just in case a call came through. They didn't feel the pause in my heartbeat every time I heard a car door slam somewhere down the block. It was in that waiting that I started to disappear, not all at once, but in pieces. First, I stopped baking pies unless it was a holiday. Then I stopped decorating for Halloween. I turned down the invitations to church events because I didn't want to be the woman sitting alone at a table for 8. I smiled at the neighbors, waved politely, but let conversations drift by without much energy. I wasn't bitter. I was just tired of pretending the waiting didn't hurt. One morning, I found myself watching a pair of squirrels chasing each other across the garden fence. Their energy felt foreign to me. I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had knocked on my door just to say hello. My neighbor Emily waved at me from across the street. I waved back, and for a brief moment something stirred in me. Not quite hope, not yet, but the awareness that I still existed, that the world was still moving, even if I had stopped. That day, I dusted off the piano in the living room. I hadn't played since George's funeral. The keys felt colder than I remembered, but the sound was still true. I played a single song, halting and slow, but it filled the room with something other than silence. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting. I was listening, not for footsteps on the porch or the ring of the phone, but for my own breath, steady and alive in the quiet. And that changed everything. The hallway was long and narrow, stretching from the front door to the back of the house, like a spine connecting everything I had ever loved. In the soft morning light, it took on a quiet glow, filtered through old lace curtains that hadn't been changed since George passed. Dust floated in the air like time refusing to settle. The wallpaper was faded, the corners curling just slightly. I hadn't had the heart to replace it. It still bore the scratches from when Jason was small, racing through with a toy sword in one hand and a towel tied around his neck like a cape. That hallway had once echoed with life. Now it echoed with memory. Each step I took down that corridor was a step through a film reel of the past. I could almost hear George's slow, heavy boots after a long shift at the mill. The way he'd pause to kiss me hello before setting his toolbox by the door. I could picture Jason running barefoot, leaving behind a trail of muddy footprints I used to scold him for, but secretly loved. That hallway had seen birthdays, scraped knees, arguments, apologies. It had witnessed the building of a family, and now it stood like a museum, quiet, untouched, lined with photos of people who no longer crossed its threshold. I often walked it slowly in the mornings, coffee cup in hand, letting the creaks beneath my slippers remind me I was still here. The house never let me forget that. Even in its stillness, it spoke to me. Through every shifting floorboard and sighing radiator, it asked me to remember, and I did. One picture in particular always caught my eye. It was Jason at age 10, missing a front tooth, holding a baseball glove almost as big as his head. George had taken that picture on the first day of Little League. Jason had looked straight into the lens, eyes wide, proud, certain that the world was his. That frame, silver-edged and slightly tarnished, hung beside a photo of our last Christmas together. years ago now. In it, Jason was already distracted, half turned toward his phone, while I smiled too brightly at the camera, trying not to notice the distance that had crept in between us. The photographs hadn't aged the way I had. They stayed frozen in time, mocking the years I had spent waiting for new ones to add. At night, the hallway became something else entirely. I never turned on the bright lights. I preferred the glow from the wall sconces, just enough to cast soft shadows. In that dimness, I often thought I saw motion where there was none, a flicker at the corner, a suggestion of footsteps. I wasn't losing my mind. It wasn't fear. It was familiarity, memory taking shape in the quiet. I didn't chase it away. Sometimes, when sleep was slow to come, I would sit on the bench under the coat rack and simply exist. Let the silence settle around me like a blanket. It was in these moments I felt George most. Not in the bedroom where we had shared our nights, not in the kitchen where I still cooked for one, but here, in this narrow place between rooms, where everything once passed through. His presence wasn't spectral, it was structural. He had built this hallway. His hands had smoothed these walls. He had stood here with me year after year, watching our son grow. The ghosts I felt weren't haunting me. They were reminding me of who I had been, of what this house had once meant, of how full it had been. It was also in this hallway where the loneliness stung the most. Not because I was afraid of being alone, but because I had not always been. The contrast was sharpest here. When Jason stopped visiting, it wasn't just my living room he vacated. He left behind silence in a place that used to hum with motion, and I was left walking its length alone, tracing a path that once carried the rhythm of family, now reduced to the soft shuffle of one set of feet. Still, I maintained it with care. I dusted the frames weekly. I polished the floor. I rearranged a few pieces of decor now and then, not to modernize it, but to keep it from feeling forgotten. I couldn't bear the thought of letting it fall into disrepair, even if no one else ever saw it. It was my temple, my timeline, my bridge between what was and what still somehow could be. And every time I walked it, I held on to the hope, not expectation, but hope, that perhaps one day footsteps other than mine would echo there again. Until then, I walked slowly. I let the ghosts keep me company, and I reminded myself that even in solitude, this house still remembered, and so did I. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite, not for the food, although I loved the ritual of it, the slow thaw of the turkey, the spices, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg drifting through the kitchen, but because it had once meant something more. It was a gathering point, a pause in the year when family circled back to one another. When George was alive, we would spend the whole day together, him basting the turkey every 30 minutes as if it were a sacred duty, me scolding him for sneaking spoonfuls of sweet potatoes before they were done. After he passed, I clung to the traditions like lifelines. Even when the house grew quieter, I still made everything. I still set the table for more than one. I still polished the silver and ironed the good tablecloth with its tiny stitched pumpkins, even if no one but me noticed. That particular Thanksgiving, the last one I would ever wait for, I woke before sunrise. The sky was a slate gray and rain tapped against the windows, but I didn't mind. I lit candles in the kitchen and started with the stuffing. My hands moved with the memory of dozens of holidays before, chopping onions, measuring breadcrumbs, whisking eggs. I didn't need a recipe anymore. I knew it all by heart. I kept glancing at the clock, doing silent math. If Jason and Elena left Chicago early, they'd arrive just after noon. That's what Jason had said when he'd called the week before. His voice clipped and distracted, but the words still spoken. "We'll be there, Mom. We'll try to be early." It wasn't a promise exactly, but it was enough. By 11, the turkey was golden in the oven, the pies cooling on the rack, the table set with the good plates. I had even pulled out the decorative place cards I used to make when Jason was a boy, his name written in my old cursive, tucked into a tiny cornucopia. It felt childish now, but I placed it anyway, a whisper to the past. I changed clothes just before noon, a deep burgundy sweater, pearl earrings, the soft scent of lilac I knew Jason once liked. I brushed my hair and checked the mirror twice. I wanted to look like someone worth visiting, someone worth remembering. By 1 o'clock, I began to worry, though I told myself not to. Traffic, weather, kids maybe. Maybe they stopped for coffee. Maybe they lost track of time. I poured a small glass of wine to calm my nerves and stood by the front window watching the street. By 2, I sat at the table, hands folded, listening for the sound of a car door, the jingle of the front gate. I didn't eat. I didn't want to break the magic of what still might be. Every time a car passed, I held my breath. By 3, I knew. The call came just after. I recognized Jason's number immediately, and something in my chest lifted, but I didn't answer right away. I let it ring twice before picking up. His voice was familiar, too casual, apologetic in a way that felt practiced. "Something came up," he said. "Elena's not feeling great. The kids are exhausted. We figured maybe Christmas instead." I told him it was okay. I told him to take care of his family. I told him I understood. And then I sat back down at that full, untouched table and stared at the candles, their flames flickering in the empty space between plates. I ate in silence that night. Not much. Just a slice of turkey, a spoonful of mashed potatoes. I packed the rest away in containers, labeled them like I always did, stacked them in the fridge in a kind of mechanical daze. Then I sat in the living room with my wine, the fire crackling, and stared into the middle distance for what felt like hours. The house was so still, it felt like the air had forgotten how to move. Even the wind outside had quieted, as if in sympathy. At some point, I walked down the hallway, past the photos, past Jason's empty childhood room, and sat at the foot of my bed. I didn't cry. I just sat there, listening to nothing. It wasn't just that he hadn't come. It was the slow, sharp realization that I had waited for someone who no longer remembered how to come home. Not really, not where it mattered. That night, something in me closed, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. I blew out the candles, turned off the porch light, and put away the extra place cards for good. Thanksgiving had once been a feast of family. Now it was a line drawn in the dust, and I had finally stopped standing on the wrong side of it. After that Thanksgiving, the house felt different, not heavier, not colder, just clearer, as if the silence no longer pretended to be anything else. It was no longer waiting or mourning. It was just silence, and somehow I could finally hear myself inside it. The days moved slowly but steadily. I swept the porch, refilled the bird feeders, trimmed the rose bushes even though winter had already begun to settle in. I did it not out of obligation, but because my hands needed to move and the earth never judged what you brought to it. There was comfort in the routine, in the hum of small tasks. It gave shape to the long hours. That week, I noticed my neighbors more than I had before. The Carters lived 3 houses down. Peter and Emily were in their early 40s, kind people with a warmth I had always noticed from a distance, but never stepped close enough to feel. Their daughter Sophie was maybe 8 or 9, always riding her bike in circles, her laughter bright against the gray streets. I had waved to them 100 times, but never crossed the line between familiarity and connection. Then, one afternoon, I saw Peter struggling with their trash bin. It had tipped in the wind, garbage spilling across the driveway. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and walked over. We cleaned it up together, quietly, quickly, as if we'd done it a dozen times. When we were done, he thanked me, his smile genuine. Emily appeared in the doorway, holding a steaming mug. She offered it to me without a word. I took it. It was chamomile. That evening, I was invited in. Their home was full of noise and warmth. Coats hung by the door, artwork taped to the fridge, books stacked messily on the coffee table. It felt lived in, not staged. I sat on their couch with the mug in my hand, while Sophie chattered about a school play and Peter turned on the fireplace. Emily asked about the garden, said she'd always admired the lavender near my front walk. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone asked me about something I had made. Over the next weeks, it became a quiet rhythm. Sometimes Emily would knock with a small loaf of bread she had baked. Sometimes Sophie would leave a drawing in my mailbox. Once, Peter came by to help me repair the hinges on the garden gate. I never asked. They just showed up, and I let them. One snowy Saturday, Sophie and I built a small snowman together. She insisted we give it a name, Mrs. Buttons. I let her use 2 of my old gardening gloves for the arms. Her hands were red with cold, her nose running, and yet I had not laughed like that in years. She told me I reminded her of a character in her favorite book. I didn't ask who. I just let the compliment wrap around me. Emily later confessed that they had worried about me, that they had seen the lights on late into the night, the drawn blinds, the untouched wreath on my front door. I told her the truth, that I had grown tired of waiting for people who only remembered me when it was convenient. She didn't offer pity, only a soft nod and a plate of cookies that we shared in comfortable silence. I began to feel a shift in my chest, not sudden, not loud, but real, something like breath after holding it too long. I invited them over one evening. I cooked a modest dinner, nothing fancy, just chicken stew and fresh rolls, and set the table for 4. I didn't light candles. I didn't overthink it. I let the moment be what it was. They arrived with a small bouquet of grocery store flowers and a bottle of cider. Sophie gave me a card with a crooked heart drawn in crayon. After they left that night, I didn't feel the usual hollowness. The house wasn't full again, but it wasn't echoing either. It occurred to me that family wasn't always built from blood or legal bonds. Sometimes it was shaped quietly, over shared snowmen and porch repairs, in borrowed mugs and thoughtful silence. I didn't tell them how much those moments meant to me. I didn't want to make it heavier than it was. But I began to keep the porch light on longer. I cleared the walkway not just for myself, but for the footprints I hoped would return. The Carters didn't try to fix anything. They simply made space for me to exist again, outside the frame of memory, beyond the role of forgotten mother. And in doing so, they reminded me that I hadn't disappeared. I had simply been waiting for the right people to see me again. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. The snow melted in uncertain patches, revealing brown grass beneath, brittle and matted, like something that had been forgotten for too long. But the light was different. It came earlier, stayed longer. The air no longer bit at my skin. It brushed it gently, as though testing permission to return. I stood on my porch in the mornings wrapped in a shawl, holding a cup of tea, and watched the fog retreat across the quiet street. The silence had changed again. It was no longer heavy. It was fertile. Something had shifted inside me. I felt it in the way my shoulders no longer tensed at every creak in the floorboards, in the way my hands moved more eagerly through tasks I had once done only to fill time. I began waking up with plans, not for others, but for myself. Small things, humble things. I wanted to trim the hedges. I wanted to repaint the mailbox. I wanted to plant something, anything, just to see it grow. The garden had always been my therapy, but this year it felt like resurrection. I cleared the old leaves, broke apart the soil with fingers that had grown stiff but still remembered. I bought packets of seeds, wildflowers, marigolds, basil, and lavender, and pressed them into the earth like secrets. Each one was a private promise, not to anyone else, just to me. One afternoon, I took down the curtains in the front room. I replaced them with sheer white ones that let the sun spill across the floor in wide, generous bands. I opened windows and let the breeze push through every room. It was as though the house exhaled with me. Not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet acceptance of something new, something better. I began to walk each morning, just around the block, slowly at first. I noticed things I had ignored before: the shape of the clouds, the rust on a neighbor's fence, the way robins argued in the tree above the post box. Life was everywhere, stubborn and shameless. It did not ask to be seen. It simply was. I realized I could be that way too. I started keeping a notebook, not a journal, not quite. Just pages filled with things I noticed, memories that surfaced, thoughts that had nowhere else to go. I wrote about the way the sun felt on my neck. I wrote about George's laugh, about Jason's freckles as a boy, about the way lilacs used to bloom outside the bedroom window. The act of writing was not about preserving the past. It was about claiming my presence in the now. Neighbors began to greet me with more than a nod. A few stopped to talk. Some brought over cookies or garden clippings. I invited them in sometimes, not always, only when it felt right. I was not trying to fill the house. I was letting it breathe again, at its own pace. On one of those afternoons, I found a letter tucked into my mailbox. It was handwritten, addressed to me, but without a return address. Inside was a short note from a young woman named Claire. She had grown up on this street 2 blocks down and remembered me from her childhood. She wrote about the time I had given her a Band-Aid after she'd fallen off her bike. She remembered the way my porch always smelled like rosemary and that I had once let her pick a flower from my garden as long as it had a buddy. She thanked me for being kind when she had needed it most, for being the kind of adult she remembered fondly. I read it twice, then again. I didn't realize I had tears in my eyes until I blinked them away. That note stayed on my fridge for weeks. It reminded me that small things matter, that even unnoticed kindness leaves footprints somewhere. I began to feel beautiful again, not in the way magazines use the word, not with painted lips or tightened skin, but in the way birds return without being asked, in the way laughter finds its way back into a quiet room. I would catch my reflection in the mirror and no longer flinch. I would see a woman who had lived, who had survived grief, silence, abandonment, and had not turned to stone. I still didn't hear from Jason, but I no longer checked my phone at night. I no longer counted the days since his last message. I no longer made excuses on his behalf. Spring had given me something else, the truth that I was not defined by who did not show up. I was defined by who I had chosen to become. I was a woman who smiled at strangers, who planted things just to watch them grow, who took long walks and long breaths and sat in the sun without apology. And for the first time in years, I didn't just feel alive. I felt awake. The folder had been in the bottom drawer of my desk for years. It was navy blue, slightly bent at the corners, and sealed with one of those cheap brass fasteners I had once used in my office job before retirement. I had tucked it away when I first drafted my will with George, back when we still believed in the rhythm of the years ahead. After he passed, I made adjustments, small changes, but the folder remained in that same drawer, silent and patient. That morning, I woke early. The sky was still pale, the sun barely visible behind a curtain of spring clouds. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the dew slip off the edge of the railing. The garden was waking up, tiny green shoots pushing up through the damp soil, the lavender beginning to stretch itself toward the light. I took a sip of coffee, then stood without hesitation and walked to the study. There was no particular trigger, no sudden message, no knock on the door. It was simply time. I pulled open the drawer slowly, the way one might open an old box of letters from a life long faded. The folder came out smoothly. It was heavier than I remembered. Inside were documents layered in years, copies of birth certificates, property records, insurance policies, and the will itself, annotated and corrected in black ink. I had gone over it many times, always with the intention of doing what was fair. But fairness is a changing thing. It is not measured by legal language or inheritance formulas. It is measured in presence, in care, in the weight of a hand held in dark times, in the sound of footsteps that still echo in a hallway long after they've passed. I set the folder on the dining table, cleared the space around it, and brought over a notepad. My handwriting had grown slower over the years, but it remained steady. I began drafting new instructions, pausing often to reflect not on who deserved what, but on who had been there, who had stayed when it was hard, who had made space for me without being asked. Names shifted on the page. Jason's name, once confidently listed at the top, now sat in limbo. My hand hovered over it for a long time. I thought of the empty seat at Thanksgiving, the unread messages, the casual distance that had become our normal. I thought of the promises, forgotten as easily as weekend errands. I thought of the hallway pictures, his smiling childhood, our fading connection, and I knew a name does not guarantee a relationship. Blood does not promise kindness. I added the Carters. It wasn't about spite. It wasn't about revenge. It was about gratitude and clarity. Peter and Emily had shown up with open hands and no expectations. Their daughter Sophie had brought laughter back into my yard. They reminded me that connection didn't need permission or pedigree. It only needed sincerity. I worked slowly, carefully. I reviewed the legal phrasing I had underlined months ago and updated the beneficiary section. I included a letter, handwritten, sealed in a separate envelope, not addressed to the court, but to those who would read it afterward. A quiet explanation, a gentle truth. Once finished, I slid everything back into the folder, now thicker, fuller, heavier, with intention. I called my lawyer later that day. We scheduled a time to finalize the updates. He didn't ask why. He knew better. When you reach a certain age, people stop questioning your choices, especially when you speak with calm conviction. The act of updating those papers felt less like rewriting a document and more like rewriting a boundary. I was no longer tethered to the fantasy of family that lived only in my hopes. I was rooted now in the reality of who had stood beside me when I had been invisible, who had looked me in the eye and seen me whole. Later that evening, I placed the folder in a new drawer, one easier to reach. I labeled it plainly. There would be no guessing games when the time came, no frantic phone calls or uncertain searches, just a clean, honest path to what I had decided. The wind picked up outside. I lit a candle in the hallway and let its flame flicker against the familiar walls. The house felt still, but not empty. It had witnessed my grief. Now it bore witness to my resolve. The papers were not about endings. They were about finally choosing myself. The phone call came on a quiet Tuesday. The sky outside was flat and overcast, the color of damp linen. I had just finished folding laundry, stacking clean towels in the linen closet, when I heard the faint vibration from the kitchen counter. I didn't rush to answer it. I walked slowly, methodically, wiping my hands on my skirt, as if I already knew who it was and what it would sound like. His name glowed on the screen. Jason. I hadn't seen it there in months. I stood still for a moment, letting the familiar shape of the letters settle into my chest. I picked up the phone, not out of urgency, but because the silence between us had grown too long and too deep. I didn't want to leave it untouched forever. His voice was tight, wrapped in the kind of politeness that didn't feel like home. I listened. I let him speak first. He said he had been busy. He said things had been difficult. I heard excuses softened into pleasantries. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer warmth he hadn't earned. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a monologue. I simply spoke the facts as I knew them to be now. I told him what I had done, not with anger, but with certainty. I told him the papers had been changed, that his inheritance was no longer automatic, that his absence had left a different kind of mark than he thought. He was quiet, the kind of quiet people use when they are searching for outrage, but find only embarrassment. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just didn't know what to say. I could almost hear the thoughts colliding behind his silence. The disbelief, the shock, the dawning understanding that I hadn't waited for him to return before choosing to move on. I had once imagined this moment as dramatic, emotional, tearful even, but it wasn't. It was clean, cold like clear water. I had rehearsed it many times, and yet now it felt like reading a final chapter of a book I no longer felt connected to. Familiar but distant. I let him know it wasn't about punishment. It was about presence. I had lived long enough to know that loyalty was not owed. It was demonstrated. I told him I had made my choices based on who had shown up when I needed someone, on who had asked how I was without needing anything in return, on who had knocked at my door with kindness instead of convenience. He didn't try to apologize. Not really. Perhaps he knew it was too late for that, or perhaps he still didn't believe I would follow through, but I didn't need him to believe me. I had already acted. The folder was sealed. The signature was inked. My name carried weight again, not just as a mother, but as a person with boundaries and agency. We ended the call not with warmth, but with finality. I stood there for a long time afterward, phone still in hand, staring out the kitchen window. The backyard was blooming again. The daffodils had opened. The grass was brighter. The sky remained gray, but the light underneath it had begun to change. I made tea and sat in the living room with the cup warming my hands. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel regret. I felt a calm so deep it was almost sacred. I had spoken my truth. I had delivered the message I had once believed I would never have the strength to say aloud. The house was quiet again, but no longer waiting. I was no longer waiting, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation for that. The house never changed dramatically. It didn't need to. It wasn't about renovations or new furniture or the smell of fresh paint. It was about how I moved through it, how I claimed it, how I let it become mine again in the quiet, deliberate ways that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. The front steps still creaked. The windows still fogged in the early mornings. The tiles in the hallway still bore faint scratches from when Jason used to run his toy trucks down the corridor, colliding them into the baseboards like miniature wrecking balls. But I stopped looking at those marks as relics of something I had lost. They became memories, yes, but not ones that hurt anymore. They were simply part of the story etched into the bones of the place I called home. I began to take ownership of the space in a new way, not out of duty, but with intention. I cleaned not to impress, but to reset the energy of the rooms. I moved pictures around. I replaced frames. I took down the ones that made me feel like a ghost in someone else's story, and put up ones that reminded me of who I was when I smiled without fear of fading. I added color, curtains in soft green, a rug with oranges and golds that reminded me of autumn fields. I planted tulips along the walkway, bold reds and purples that shouted back against the grays of early spring. I wanted joy to meet me at the door. I wanted warmth to live in the corners again. The kitchen, once the heart of the home for others, became mine again. I cooked not for a full table, but for the joy of taste. I learned new recipes, sometimes burning them, sometimes surprising myself. I set a place for one with care, a cloth napkin, a real plate, candles lit just for me. I sat in the evenings with music playing softly, jazz sometimes, classical on rainy days, folk when the windows were open. The breeze moved through the rooms like a guest who knew she was welcome, bringing with it the scent of rosemary and lilac. I would rest on the sofa, a book in my lap, a blanket over my legs, and marvel at how simple contentment could be when you stopped asking others to define it. I did not wait for visitors. I did not expect phone calls. If they came, I answered them with the grace of someone who had nothing to prove. If they didn't, I didn't shrink. I didn't ache. I filled my days with intention instead of expectation. The neighbors still waved when they passed. The Carters still brought cookies, sometimes stayed for tea. Sophie would leave chalk drawings on my driveway. Once she drew a picture of me, smiling, with the word happy written in crooked letters above my head. I kept that drawing on the fridge like it was a priceless painting. One afternoon, I walked through each room of the house slowly, not as an inspection, but as an acknowledgement. I ran my hand along the stair rail George had built with his own hands. I touched the door frame where Jason's height had been measured in pencil for years. I stood by the window that faced the west and watched the sun pour across the floor in a golden sheet. This wasn't just a house, it was a vessel of joy and grief, of presence and absence, of memories worn smooth and new ones still forming. It held my laughter, my silence, my private songs hummed while dusting the shelves. It held the pain of being overlooked and the power of choosing myself in the aftermath. I was no longer afraid to be alone here. This space didn't echo with abandonment anymore. It resonated with something else, freedom maybe, or peace, or simply the unshakable sense that I was exactly where I belonged, not waiting, not forgotten, not broken. I poured a glass of wine that night and took it to the porch. The stars were beginning to appear one by one. The night air was cool and familiar. I looked out over the yard, the new blooms swaying gently, the wind chimes singing a soft, steady note. This was my home, not because it held others, but because it held me, and I was finally enough.